Good evening. My name is Selim Jahan. I'm the director of the Human Development Report Office in United Nations Development Program. A warm welcome to you all to this 2015 Mahbub Haq Memorial Lecture. We are very proud to have sponsored this particular lecture honoring the memory and the intellectual contribution of Mahbub, the creator of the Human Development Reports, and also one of the pioneers of the Human Development Movement. His intellectual contributions, his pragmatic contribution to policymaking, and also his thought leadership have brought the Human Development Movement and the Human Development Reports to where we are now. So in that context, this particular public lecture is very dear to our heart. And we are very honored and privileged this year to have Professor Ernesto Cedillo, the former president of Mexico, who has kindly consented to deliver the 2015 Mahbub Haq Memorial Lecture. Professor Cedillo has such an illustrious career that even to summarize it would be a difficult task. So I'm not going there. I'll just highlight 3 points which are very close to what we have been doing. First, if I remember it correctly, that during his presidential campaign, his motto was, and if it is translated into English, is that well-being for your family. And during his tenure, the whole program, which used to be called Progresa, one of the anti-poverty social protection program started. Later on, it was renamed to Oportunidades, has been replicated in different parts of the world, was highly celebrated in different quarters, and very recently, if I understand it correctly, that it has been renamed to Prospera. The second point I would like to highlight that Professor Cedillo was a member of the Millennium Development Project Task Team, and the work of which has really influenced the 2003 Global Human Development Report. We also have had the honor and privilege of having him as a member of the advisory panel to the Regional Human Development Report of Latin America and the Caribbean last year on citizen security. And Professor Cedillo is currently the Frederick Eisman 74 Director of the Center for the Study of Globalization at Yale. He is also the Professor of International Economics and Area Studies and Politics at that particular university. He has been a great voice and is still a great voice on the issue of globalization, particularly for developing countries and the least developed countries. So it is really befitting that Professor Cedillo would deliver the 2015 Mahbub Haq Lecture. The theme on which he is going to talk is Tale of Latin America and Africa, growing policy challenges at a time of vanishing tailwinds. So it is my honor and privilege to request Professor Ernesto Cedillo to come to the podium and deliver the 2015 Mahbub Haq Lecture.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Dear faculty members, dear students, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to be part of this excellent conference of the Human Development and Capabilities Association, and in particular for being asked to deliver the Mahbub Haq Lecture. Of course, this is a great opportunity to pay my modest tribute to that great Pakistani leader, thinker, and alumnus of my own university, where he got his PhD, who, thanks to his work, particularly for the UNDP, left a significant influence on the way we think today about development. As we all know, the discussion about what development is and how it can be pursued more effectively underwent a remarkable watershed with the publication of the UNDP Human Development Report 1990. Initiating and nurturing this incredibly consequential project all the way to its consolidation was to the merit of Dr. Haq, and for that he earned a place of distinction among the great development economists of the 20th century. Needless to say, his achievement could not have been realized without the decisive collaborations that he was able to harness from a set of outstanding individuals, first and foremost our admired Amartya Sen. I suspect that Lord Keynes would have provided a variation of his famous submission on the influence of some defunct economists on practical men, had he known that Amartya's Tanner lectures would start to be operationalized only 10 years after the delivery, with the splendid work that he produced with and for his friend and fellow undergraduate at Cambridge, Mahbub Haq, in order to create the first UNDP Human Development Report. And of course, now as then, to our happiness and enjoyment, Amartya is still amazing us with his unique intellectual blend of high-power economics and political philosophy. I do not think I will diminish any of the praiseworthiness of Haq and Sen by also recognizing the other people from the UNDP and outside that institution who were listed as contributors to that first edition of the Human Development Report. As I look at that list again, I recognize not only other authors who have been influential toward my own views on various subjects, but also persons to whom my personal debt extends well beyond the purely intellectual. I see Lord Desai, who after my retirement from government and political service in Mexico, literally took me back to school, bringing me to none other than the London School of Economics. And very especially, and I really stress this, very especially, I see in that list my mentor and friend, Gustav Ranis, who taught me development economics at Yale, tormented me with grace as chair of my doctoral oral examinations, and a quarter of a century later, after I had completed my Mexican professional and political cycle, was a decisive force in my return to my alma mater, where I have confirmed, dear friends, for already 13 years, that indeed there is life after the presidency. I believe that William P. Draper, the administrator of the UNDP at the time, who attracted and supported Dr. Haq, also should get recognition for pioneering the Human Development Report. Interestingly, I must also include Bill Draper in my long list of eternal creditors, for he was the one of the key alumni benefactors who made possible the creation of the Center for the Study of Globalization, where I have had my primary appointment at my university. Ultimately, we recognize Dr. Haq and the other individuals behind the HDR for the influence that the report they created has had in the theory and, more importantly, the practice of development policy. That this influence has been significant, I can attest as a former practitioner. For those of us involved in the design and execution of development policies, the publication of the HDR was significantly useful. This was not only because it provided a new framework with which to assess our respective countries' development progress and exemplify its application with the relative comparative statistics, including the sharp condensation into the Human Development Index, but also because the report, in a relatively few pages, provided best knowledge on the theory and experience of development. A number of concepts and observations contained in the 1990 and subsequent issues of the HDR would prove relevant as I thought about the development challenges of my own and other Latin American countries. A project where I would find the HDR's observations particularly reassuring for our own concerns, priors, and research was during the conception of the pioneering conditional cash transfers anti-poverty program that, as was mentioned before, came to be known as Progresa. In retrospect, I can highlight, among others, the following observations provided by the Human Development Report that resonated as we thought about the design of the Progresa program. The HDR, based on the experience of a number of developing countries, determined that it is possible to achieve high levels of human development if the available resources are used skillfully to expand human capabilities. It submitted that even in the absence of satisfactory economic growth or a relatively even income distribution, countries could improve human development through well-structured public expenditures. It argued that social subsidies are absolutely necessary for poorer income groups. By invoking, among other reasons, that private returns to primary education are very high, the HDR effectively made the point that promoting human development only at the expense of economic growth is a false trade-off. It also informed of large disparities in human development between rich and poor, between men and women, and between rural and urban areas. The gap between men and women was particularly pervasive in education. It stressed that the special returns to female education were higher than the average social returns for every level of education in terms of reduced fertility, lower population growth, reduced child mortality, reduced school dropout rates, and improved family nutrition. And yet, it reminded that in most societies, women fare less well than men. As children, they have less access to education and training, work longer hours for lower incomes, and have few property rights or none. The HDR emphasized that scarce budgetary resources can be economized and the effectiveness of development programs enhanced by tailoring them to the specific needs and interests of the intended beneficiaries. In other words, by using targeted interventions that in one of their modalities aim at limiting the access to the benefits to a well-defined segment of the population. Without fully disqualifying this modality, the 1990 HDR, interestingly, expressed some concern about the management viability of tightly targeted programs. Fortunately, we Mexicans proved them wrong. To be honest, the stimuli and intellectual sources tapped to embark on the construction of Progresa were multiple. First, there was the sense of frustration that I had developed as Secretary of Education about the tough challenge of getting children in Mexico's poorest communities to start and complete their primary education. Notwithstanding the availability of schools near their homes, more frequently than not, children from the poorest families continued to fail to complete their basic education in a much bigger proportion than children from families with higher incomes. There was a sort of vicious cycle that tended to perpetuate poverty and had to be broken. There was also the experience we had acquired through a number of anti-poverty programs, tried over time in Mexico, some with good results and others that definitely failed to deliver. A frequent shortcoming of those programs was their failure to reach their objective population effectively. To minimize the risk of failure from the very beginning, and this beginning occurred when I was still campaigning for office in the summer of 1994, I took the decision that a lot of thinking and inquiry should be done before deciding on the specific features of the anti-poverty program to which I was committing before the Mexican electorate. Once in office, the team in charge of developing a specific proposal undertook a thorough review of the literature and of practical experience, good and bad. Furthermore, we carried out pilot testing of a number of aspects before giving Progresa its final form. Weary of past experiences in Mexico and other Latin American countries, where the design and management of anti-poverty programs sought objectives that were more political than truly social and were not infrequently tailored to nurture clienteles for those in power, I insisted that we needed a program based on best knowledge, not on presidential inspiration and aspiration, which very frequently is wrong. Luckily, just as had happened to Haq when he set out to do the HDR, I was able to count on an incredibly competent and devoted team to develop Progresa. Naming all the contributors would be impossible to do here, but I cannot really talk about Progresa without naming Jose Pepe Gomez de Leon and Santiago Levy, and acknowledge the decisive role they play in the design, testing, and eventually management of the program. Those two exemplary academics and public servants applied themselves, along with their respective teams, with singular social devotion and intellectual rigor to conceive and structure and working mechanics of the program. Our objective of having a truly technically sound program so that it would stand a good chance to be effective implied a rather long process of preparation, in fact, more than 2 years before we were ready to launch it. During that period, both Levy and Gomez de Leon would perform other important duties for the Mexican government, along with their work to develop Progresa. Santiago was Undersecretary for the Budget, and Pepe was head of the National Population Council. When Progresa finally was launched in August 1997, Santiago continued to be in charge of the federal budget and consolidated his position as a chief steward of Mexico's fiscal responsibility, while remaining attentive to the good advance of Progresa, while Pepe became the head of the program. For 2.5 years, with incredibly hard work and social commitment, Gomez de Leon led the growth of the program without compromising, even minimally, its principles of equity, transparency, and efficiency. He would make endless journeys into the field, making sure that things were being done in the right way. He would take me frequently to visit communities and families covered by the program. Pepe was able to sense that Progresa was solidly on track to succeed before a bad cancer took his still relatively young life in early 2000. By now, there is a vast literature describing the characteristics of Progresa and its renamed successor programs that had been adopted by the Mexican federal administration that followed the one over which I presided. There is also substantial research on its impact on poverty reduction in Mexico and its influence on many other CCCT programs adopted in other countries. So there is no need here to go into any detailed description of the program and its results. That Progresa became a kind of an international gold standard of anti-poverty programs in just a few years probably has to do with some of its key features, such as its laser-sharp targeting of the beneficiary population, its very clever nutrition, health, and school attendance conditionality for the provision of its well-calibrated cash and in-kind subsidies, its deliberate good gender bias, expressed not only in higher subsidies for girls than for boys, but also in designating the mother in the household as the legal recipient of the benefits, and its transparency and enforcement of key normative and operational aspects, not least the eligibility and selection requirements of the beneficiary population. It also helped that the program was designed practically from its inception to be rigorously evaluated, and so it was. It was the genius of Gómez de León that in the process of designing the targeting methodology, and this was very sophisticated, he also designed a database that would allow scientific systematic evaluation of the program. Thanks to that experimental design, Progresa was scientifically evaluated by internationally recognized researchers just 3 years after it was launched, with encouraging results that convinced the next Mexican administration to preserve the program rather than scrap it, as the president newly elected in 2000 had threatened to do during his electoral campaign. Curiously, for better or for worse, that early evaluation of Progresa also boosted the use of randomization as a method to measure the impact of development policy interventions, an approach that nowadays is widely used and abused by development economists. We were creating a monster. Progresa was only one of the things that happened in the years after the publication of the 1990 HDR that would cause a fortunate change in some very worrisome facts that had been reported precisely in that first report. While highlighting that the developing countries had made significant progress towards human development in the previous 3 decades, it also reported that in many countries in Africa and Latin America, the 1980s had witnessed stagnation or even reversals in human achievements. Shockingly, among such reversals, the HDR would reveal that child malnutrition and infant mortality had grown at rising rates in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America during those years. The economic mismanagement and the inevitable adjustment it caused made both Africa and Latin America pay, as the HDR said, a heavy, very heavy social price. Sensibly, the 1990 HDR would point to Africa as the region that should get the highest priority in any international effort to improve human development. With some reason, other observers of global development were calling the growth performance of the African nations the worst economic disaster of the 20th century. The early gains in per capita GDP that most African countries attained in the decade or so after independence, around 1960, started to vanish around the time of the 1973 oil shock. The fall in income was particularly marked in sub-Saharan countries, whose GDP per capita started to contract in 1974. Shockingly, by 1995, the average per capita GDP of sub-Saharan countries was lower than it had been a quarter of a century earlier. This implies that the income gap between Africa and the rest of the world, the biggest of any region to begin with, widened even further during that period. Along with the economic contraction came a significant deterioration in the continent's poverty rate. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the poverty rate worsened from 48% in 1970 to 60% in 1995. In the first half of the 1980s alone, as reported in the 1990 HDR, the number of Africans below the poverty line had risen by 2/3. Since the relatively richer Africans did not suffer much during the times of contraction or stagnation, while the poor grew in large numbers and became even poorer, income distribution further deteriorated during that period of African impoverishment. Fortunately, what for too long looked like a secular disease of the African economy somehow began to abate around the mid-1990s. The shift went almost unnoticed for a few years, but had become a new trend of growth revival by the early years of the present century. Since 2000, Africa's annual GDP growth has been averaging almost 5%, permitting GDP per capita to grow 2.5% annually on average. Remarkably, the sub-Saharan economies, after their long period of contraction or stagnation, have seen their average per capita GDP grow by close to 3% since 2000. Productivity has increased in tandem with economic growth. More importantly, there has been a significant reduction in the poverty rate. In the sub-Saharan region, the proportion of people living in extreme poverty fell from 58% in 1999 to 48% in 2010, although the absolute number of poor still rose from 380 to almost 420 million over the same period, and inequality remains extremely high. Under 5, and this is also another good result, under 5 and maternal mortality rates have dropped by around 40% since 2000. Life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa, which had risen only 3% between 1980 and 2000, has improved by 10% since 2000. Most countries on the continent have achieved near universal primary school enrollment, and half of them now have achieved gender parity among those enrolled. In the sub-Saharan countries, adult literacy rates have been rising faster than in the past, by 9% since 2000 to reach 62%, although admittedly this rate is still quite low. What triggered and further fueled an inflection point in Africa's performance around the second half of the 90s is still a matter of analysis and even debate. Some scholars and analysts give a special weight to political and even geopolitical factors in explaining the recent African awakening. Some even trace the African inflection back to the end of the Cold War. In their view, once Africa's authoritarian regimes, which were more the rule than the exception until that time, lost their unconditional support from either of the previously adversarial Cold War powers, and once they felt pressed by the wave of political liberalization that radiated from Eastern Europe, they started to surrender their grip on power. The movement towards more open and competitive political participation in several countries led to the emergence of more competent leaders and the use of better policies that not only boosted macroeconomic management, but also began to take into account the voices and interests of previously marginalized groups. Some studies go so far as to suggest a causal link between the introduction of competitive elections, more competitive exchange rates, higher agricultural prices, and enhanced agricultural productivity and output. In these views, improved governance is a fact of the new African reality, both as a result of freer political participation and a chief cause of better economic performance. An environment more propitious to growth has been determined crucially by the rise of a new civil society that has relentlessly applied pressure for better governance in a number of African countries. A drastic reduction in conflicts and political progress with the concomitant improvement in economic policies, not least better macroeconomic management and proactive private sector policies, also gave rise to more flexible attitudes on the part of foreign donors that then created more latitude for homegrown reform efforts. In this respect, the heavily indebted poor countries initiative, by making resources for better policies and not just to settle all debts, certainly helped to achieve the African shift. Some attention should also be paid to Africa's demographic transition, that by being delayed when compared with other parts of the developing world, is now a stronger source of economic growth for the continent than in other developing regions. Without diminishing the value of what Africans have done by themselves to improve the economic and social conditions in their countries, it is crucial not to underestimate that external factors have played a hugely favorable role in Africa's better performance. By far, the most important among those factors are the spike in commodity prices, which actually extended into a rather long cycle, as well as the quantum leap in foreign direct investment. Commodity prices that doubled, indeed tripled, for some products from their late 1990s levels were bound to relax the growth constraints faced by those African countries that happen to be resource-rich. Not surprisingly, booming commodity markets, in turn, stimulated international investment in those countries with natural resources. Thus, for a number of African economies, the direct gain stemming from improved terms of trade has been compounded by the benefit of much bigger flows of direct foreign investment, which have grown tenfold since 2000. It should be impossible to explain the long commodity cycle from which many African economies benefited without also noting China's demand for those commodities, which has been spurred by that country's own impressive economic growth. Chinese trade with the African continent multiplied more than tenfold between 2003 and 2013. China's foreign direct investment in Africa has grown consistently at annual rates of 15% or more for many years. As the role that China's explosive growth has played in Africa's good economic performance is brought into the picture, it is also fitting to start tackling the question of how sustainable that performance is likely to be in light of what is proving to be a permanent slowing down of the Chinese economic dynamism. The double-digit GDP growth rates that China sustained until the Great Crisis are now a thing of the past, as the country's leaders not only admit to the slowdown, but also claim to be planning assiduously for it. GDP growth of around 7% per year is still remarkable. It is a targeted new normal for the Chinese economy. But as recent events have suggested, it will not be easy to stay even in that revised growth trajectory. Slower GDP growth in China and in other larger economies was bound to have a significant impact on the international commodity markets, whose supercycle peaked 2 or so years ago. And Africa will not be the only region where the end of the supercycle could prove consequential. Latin America is also one of them. Most Latin American economies did better in the first decade of this century than they had done in the previous 2 decades. After the lost decade of the 1980s, with its harsh macroeconomic adjustment coupled with significant structural reforms, the region's growth had managed to grow at just 2.7% on average from 1991 to 2003. As the commodity cycle went into full blossom, growth accelerated up to the Great Crisis, averaging 5.3% in 2004-08. As in most other parts of the world, of course, 2009 brought with it a sharp slowdown, but recovery was quick, and by 2010, average growth in the region reached 6%. In light of the region's performance before, during, and after the crisis, it was not uncommon to hear of Latin American leaders boasting about their economies decoupling from the tribulations of the developed economies. The perceived resilience of the Latin economies, particularly those in the southern cone, was attributed at the time to the stronger fundamentals and good policies that governments were confident they had adopted and nurtured over time. The Latin American newly acquired confidence was reinforced by results on the human development front. The successive human development reports provided a proper account of how the HDI and its components have continued to advance in most Latin American countries over the years of the present century. By far, however, the most significant evolution observed over the course of the 2000s and marking a positive discontinuity with the past is the decrease in the absolute and relative number of people living in poverty, as well as the improvements in income distribution. Unfortunately, as has been the case in many African countries, the resource-rich nations of the Southern Cone might have overestimated the share of their own policies and underestimated the share of external factors, particularly the commodity boom and its chief engine, China's growth, in explaining their improved economic performance. After the strong rebound of 2010, the story of Latin America's growth has started to look like the old story of only mediocre growth. 2015 will be the 5th consecutive year of decreasing growth in the region, reaching at best 0.5 percentage point. The macroeconomic policy margins that existed for those economies up to the 2008-09 crisis are now practically exhausted. The China engine has slowed while most advanced countries keep flirting with a stagnation. Both factors making it likely that we may be witnessing the start of a long period of declining commodity prices. And the Damocles sword of rising interest rates and more stringent international capital markets are all factors that have come to haunt the region. The most painful consequence of the new Latin American situation would be a lasting setback in human development, a direction to which some indicators are starting to point. The Economic Commission for Latin America estimates that the reduction in poverty has stopped since 2012 and foresees that the process of reducing inequality is also at serious risk of stalling. The slowdown in Africa has not yet been of the magnitude currently being endured in Latin America, but this may change as some of the large resource-based African economies start to deal with the collapse both of their commodity exports and the foreign investments associated with them. Just as in Latin America and other economies that did well while the supercycle lasted, the African economy's resilience is about to be seriously tested. If reduced demand and lower prices for African commodities are followed by much slower African growth, then it will be evident that the recent growth has been riding mostly on the shoulders of other economies' successes. If this proves to be the case, then most African nations will have only two roads ahead, either to sink back into mediocre economic performance with all its negative social and political consequences, or to embark upon more profound processes of reform to provide for other engines of economic growth that would allow them to continue making progress on the social front. Taking the bad road back would be most unfortunate, considering that even the rapid growth of the last 15 years has failed to create the jobs needed by the vast numbers of unemployed in Africa. This problem will get much worse in a slower economy, considering that many millions of young people will be entering the labor market each year in the immediate future. It is also unfortunate because the continent still confronts still high poverty rates. Sub-Saharan Africa is the only part of the world where the number of people has continued to rise despite its GDP growth, and where income, gender, and regional inequalities are not only stubbornly high, but generally rising. Next to Latin America, Africa still has the worst income distribution in the world. Africa's record in pursuing the Millennium Development Goals has been mixed, and several of the key 2015 targets are being missed. Africa's several structural weaknesses continue to be potent, but the one that offers the greatest challenge may be the political one. Despite the amazing strides towards democracy achieved in many parts of the continent since the 90s, the healthier political conditions realized in no small number of African countries are still somewhat fragile. Powerful forces are frequently at play in Africa, seeking to reverse the political reforms that allowed an improvement in government policies and the recent good economic performance. In a large number of countries, where term limits for the chief executive were adopted during the time of political reform 20 years ago or so, those limits have been removed, or at least there has been pressure to have them abolished or extended. According to good sources, a number of African states have regressed recently to lower levels of political and civil liberties. Unfortunately, political regression has also happened in some countries in Latin America, as has been shown dramatically in the case of Venezuela, that regression is also at the root of the economic disaster that Venezuelans are enduring nowadays. Political fragility is not the only structural weakness that is common both to Africa and Latin America. On the economy, they both suffer, with few exceptions, from duality disease, meaning that large proportions of their labor force are employed in the so-called informal sector. By some estimates, in the low-income countries of Africa, the informal sector generates half of national output, 80% of total employment, and 90% of new jobs. For all of Sub-Saharan Africa, the informal sector provides between 50 and 75% of total employment. For Latin America, it has been estimated that at least 55% of the labor force is employed on average in the informal sector. The 1990 Human Development Report had sounded the alert about the large size of the informal sector in Africa and Latin America. And relative to the figures there provided in 1990, the reliance on informality to employ the labor force has increased, not decreased, in both cases. People working in the informal sector are either self-employed or working in business units employing very few people. Although some informal economic activities and units may be part of a vast informal commercial network, in some cases even an international network, they must keep themselves small to remain outside the radar of taxation and regulation. When marginalization from the legal system is paired with small size, the results, which are practically automatic for each informal economic unit involved, are lack of legal identity, little or no capital, isolation from formal sources of credit and technology, and very limited markets, all of which structurally lead to very low productivity per worker employed. It is in the large size of their informal sectors and their inherently low labor productivity where the biggest economic challenge and paradoxically the most extraordinary opportunity exists for both Africa and Latin America to restore or preserve reasonable rates of economic growth. The Human Development Report itself has insisted since its very first issue that the growth of per capita income is one of the critical elements, although not the only one, in improving human development. Hence, the importance of avoiding another serious economic slide for Africa and Latin America, and for other developing countries, now that the engines that were firing during the Great Moderation seem to be running low or have even stopped. There is not a golden rule on how to go about increasing productivity and sustaining economic growth. Each and every country on both continents would need to find its own way according to their particular conditions, including their respective institutional capacities. But it should be clear that any strategy with a chance of success must contain the promotion of human development by expanding human capabilities for all, not just a few, as explained by Dr. Haq, Amartya Sen, and their co-authors a quarter of a century ago. As the African and Latin American governments and societies contend with the new, no longer propitious international conditions in order to achieve both income growth and human development, the most significant transformation needed will consist of strengthening and in some cases building the institutions without which no lasting development will be possible. Among all the necessary institutional reforms, the most urgent and important ones are those pertaining to the rule of law. To make growth inclusive and thus give it additional sources of dynamism, the playing field must be level for all African and Latin Americans. And this task starts with a system that provides justice and security for all, not only for the economic and political elites. This is an absolute precondition to truly allow Africans and Latin Americans, as Mahbub ul-Haq would dream for all peoples across the globe, to participate freely in the events and processes that shape their lives. Thank you very much.
I have a quick question for you, President. During your tenure, President Bill Clinton got that NAFTA going. Could you comment on that, its effect on human development in Mexico? And now that this TPP is about to happen, what would be the potential and the impact of human development in those 19 Asian countries in view of what happened with NAFTA?
Well, first, I think I would go back to one of the considerations that first appeared in the 1990 Human Development Report, and that was that economic growth helps, but it's not the only way to go if you want to achieve development. It has been studied over and over again. Now, NAFTA was conceived as one of the various instruments that could be used to enhance the growth possibilities of the Mexican economy. But nobody thought or suggested that NAFTA will be the response for Mexico's development problems. NAFTA was one element of just one policy, opening up the economy, engage in international trade and investment. So whatever outcomes we have had in human development could not be related, at least not in a univalent way, to NAFTA. I think the links between trade and development, and this has been studied for a long time, are not necessarily very direct and very transparent. It's part of the story, but not all of the story. I think the point that is important to make is that you can have low growth, and Mexico has had, on average, rather relatively low growth for many years, even as compared with other Latin American countries. But the encouraging thing, and this is what we must be very careful about in my country, is that we have been able to make progress on the human development indicators. And this was, again, something very important, probably unnoticed at the time in the human development report. Say, watch out. You may have low growth. You may even have, as Latin America had and still has, very bad income distribution. But if you are intelligent and if you sharpen your interventions in social policy, then you can improve human development. And by the way, if you improve human development, then you can expand your economic growth possibilities. You know, I don't tire to stress this when I speak with my students, you know. So I think the story of NAFTA has to be seen on that. I mean, nobody, at least not myself, said NAFTA is going to give us, you know, a new wonderful country. No, NAFTA was one among many instruments to pursue development. What is going to happen with TPP actually is not terribly consequential for Mexico. That's what professional economists will say. The market access that TPP will give to Mexico additionally is very small. Why? Because we already have free trade with the United States and Canada. We already have free trade with Chile. We actually have free trade agreements with some of the other partners of TPP. So I don't expect TPP to be transformative in any way. There is an opportunity, yes. Should we take it? Yes. But it's not going to be a big deal.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Appreciated the notion that political institutions are crucial to the vision that you have for the future. After spending about 3 weeks in Ethiopia this summer, I was aware of a debate going on there that I think also has relevance for Latin America, and I'd like to hear you comment on it. It's a notion of a developmental state, which stresses macroeconomic progress, a strong state that is able to focus on economic goals. But within Ethiopia, there's a division between those that are pushing what they would not call an autocratic state, but many of us would call an autocratic developmental state, versus a democratic developmental state. And one of the arguments that the democratic developmentalists argue for is that democracy has a much better chance to deal with corruption, an issue that you haven't mentioned, than the autocratic developmental state. And I'd like to hear your views on the relevance of this approach. Also, it's related to the strong incursion of Chinese FDI in the autocratic model coming from China.
Well, I did mention rule of law, right? And corruption is an aspect of a failure of the rule of law. And I said that the most important challenge for both Africa and Latin America is the question of rule of law. In my view, if we are successful in addressing that, many other aspects of our development policies and strategies will have a better chance to succeed. But if we don't make further progress on the front of rule of law, which I insist comprises the question of corruption, then the rest may fail. As to what kind of system has a better chance to succeed in establishing rule of law and therefore fight democracy, well, there is no question for me that a democratic system has a chance. And I don't say this after the fact. It is recognized that the democratic reforms, electoral reforms, that were undertaken in Mexico in the second half of the 90s, when I happened to be in office, were perhaps the most important that have had my country in many years, that allow alternation that allow divided government, that allow for the creation of really divided government with all the checks and balances that it implies. Some people, you know, over the years have told me, well, you know, don't take very seriously American scholars or the experience of the advanced countries in terms of democracy, you know. This I hear more from my Asian friends, including at the time Lee Kuan Yew, who thought, as you described, that perhaps authoritarian kind of government will have a better chance as long as they have the enlightenment to pursue the policies. Well, my response always was, well, listen, we in Latin America try everything else for 200 years. I think now we have the need and the opportunity to try democracy. Now, we are not going to build perfectly functioning democracies in a few years, but I think the progress that you can see throughout the region, including my country, is just amazing. I mean, it has happened, I would say, not over my life cycle. It has happened over one half of my life cycle. And I want to think that one half is short. It's not such a long period. But what has happened is amazing. So I would not advise the Africans, although I'm expressing concerns about the weakening of the political modernization process that had started in Africa 20 or 25 years ago. I think that if that continues, that's a terrible news for Africa. We will see political instability. We will see, as unfortunately we are seeing it more recently, violence, and it will be a dramatic setback in their development. You are suggesting that I have to catch a plane, right? Which I have to, sorry.
Yes, I mean, a democratic state is definitely better than an autocratic state, but an autocratic moderator is better than a democratic moderator. So we have to stop at this particular point because we are late for the next session, and Martin Osborne, I know that we'll have to go somewhere. I would like to thank you, Professor Cedillo, personally, as well as from all of us. Personally, because you have made reference to a number of colleagues and friends, and it brings back memories, and also for your kind words to the Human Development Report, which would really encourage us, provide incentive us to go for at least another 25 years. And from all of us, I would like to thank you for a very inspiring lecture, which we have all enjoyed. And I'm very sorry to some of the participants who have a number of questions, but I'm pretty sure that there will be other chances in future to interact with Professor Ernesto Cedillo, the former president of Mexico. Please join me for another round of applause for us.